This is part 4 of week 7 of the class Neuronal Dynamics. In the previous lecture, I've introduced the deterministic version of the spike response model. Now let's add noise. So we have the same filter description as before. Input is filtered by some filter called kappa. Output is filtered and fed back in two ways. There is a refractory filter, eta of s, accounting for refractoriness and adaptation via modulation of the membrane potential. And then there is a threshold contribution, a threshold filter, theta 1, accounting for an increased threshold immediately after a spike. The only difference is here. We now say that firing is a stochastic process with a firing intensity that depends on a momentary distance between the membrane potential, that would be the red trace here, and the threshold. So even though the membrane potential hasn't reached the threshold yet, there is already a probability that the neuron may fire. And this is exactly the notions that we have seen last week. A spike may be fired with a certain instantaneous rate, rho of t, despite the fact that the membrane potential hasn't reached the threshold yet. And this model works, for example, for the leaky integrating fire model, or for a leaky integrating fire model with adaptation, or for a nonlinear integrating fire model, and in particular, it can be combined with the spike response model. A particularly useful choice is an exponential escape rate that was discussed last week. So last week we have seen that with this noise model we can construct quantities such as the survivor function. Given the last spike occurred at t hat, what is the probability that the neuron would survive up to time t without firing again? This probability of survival decays with the firing rate rho, and therefore we can integrate this, and this is the result. Similarly, we may ask for the time-dependent interval distribution, and it turns out in order to fire the next spike at time t, the neuron has to survive from t hat to t, and then it has to fire. So we have an expression for the interval distribution. And this works for all sorts of escape rate functions. However, formulas turn out to be particularly nice if, as an escape rate, we take the exponential one. Now that's cool, because the exponential one fits well experimental data measured in cortical slices. Now, after these preparations, we can now turn to the likelihood of a spike train in this kind of noisy neuron models that are called generalized linear models. Suppose an experimentalist has injected some time-dependent current, a known current, into a neuron, and he has observed a sequence of spikes. Suppose we inject the same current in our neuron model. For example, a spike response model with escape noise, also called generalized linear model. Then, what is the likelihood that this spike train, with those specific spike times, could have been generated by our model? And as we have seen last week, we have an expression for this. And this is what this expression looks like. Let me just go over it again quickly. So here is a copy of the expression that we had on the previous slide. So the neuron has to survive from T1 to T2 without firing. That gives this term here. But before that, the neuron model had to fire at time t1, has to fire again at time t2, It has to fire again at time t3. T1 is supposed to be the first spike, so the neuron model has to survive from 0 to T1 without firing, and again it has to survive from T3 to the end of the measurement period, capital T. This gives the final term over here. We can collect all these different firing times, and they appear up here as a product. And we can collect the integrals in the exponent. It first runs from 0 to T1, then from T1 to T2, then from T2 to 3, and then from T3 to T, capital T. Well, all this gives one single integral. And as we have seen, sometimes we consider the logarithm instead of the likelihood itself. Now, this formalism works for arbitrary stochastic point processes that are characterized by this instantaneous intensity or instantaneous firing rate or hazard of firing. We have seen that if you take a spike response model with its 3 linear filters, and if we add escape noise, then we can write down the likelihood of an observed spike train, the likelihood that such a spike train could have been generated by the model. Thus, we have a generative model for spike trains. That's a technical term used in the statistical and machine learning literature. And this generative model has the properties that it depends on parameters. And we can use this dependence to find the optimal set of parameters to explain the data. That will be the topic of the next lecture. Just remember, a spike response model together with escape noise can be formulated in the framework of generalized linear models, short GLM.